Hello! Today we are going to talk about translations with fiction and I guess nonfiction, just translations in general of literature of any kind. I do want to give you a warning. It is tornado season here in Nashville and we have been storming all day. My power's been going in and out, so I don't know how this is gonna go. We'll just, it's in Mother Nature's hands. We'll see what happens. But I hauled a new translation of Beowulf recently by Maria Ivana Headley. I was mentioning that I wanted to read this because I'd originally read a translation from Seamus Heaney, I think was the big translation a few years ago of Beowulf. But I wanted to try this because it was purposefully a translation that was going for a lot higher readability for modern readers as opposed to faithfulness to the text. And I kind of mentioned in passing, like, hey, I don't know if you guys are interested in like a discussion video or my thoughts about translations. And there was a vociferous response to that saying, yes, we are interested in that. So I don't really have a lot of thoughts planned for this. We're just going to kind of let it rip and see where the conversation goes. But part of what was guiding my thought about this was I was having a discussion with my friend Leanna on Voxer probably about a month ago now, where we were talking about kind of how, if you've read something in translation, have you really read it? And this gets into a lot of really interesting, honestly, like philosophical kind of tangents in terms of epistemology and philosophy of like semantics, and I think it's called semiotics. So there's a lot of kind of deep philosophical places we can go in terms of what does it really even mean to understand each other? What does it really mean to communicate and to feel confident that kind of word action that you've taken means something to someone else? Like there's like a whole deep rabbit hole you could go down to. I don't think we'll go there for the most part today, but I thought what I would kind of talk about is I think translations exist on a spectrum of faithfulness to the text to readability to the user, or I guess the person who's reading the translation, the accessibility to them. I think that tends to be sort of the spectrum that translations for the most part exist on. So I kind of wanted to talk maybe through some of my thoughts about what side of the spectrum I tend to fall on for different kinds of books, and what I think being able to read something in its original language really means in terms of a reader's experience. So we'll just hop on in and see where we go. So in terms of faithfulness to the text in a translation, well, my degree, I have a master's in religion, so the place my mind honestly kind of goes automatically is thinking about the debates that have been had, or like, not even just debates, but, you know, wars that have been fought, and kind of the strong religious convictions that many people throughout time and place have felt about their religious texts and whether or not they can or cannot be translated out of the language that they were originally written in. So for example, I believe still in Islam, you are not really supposed to have like a Quran that is not in the original, I believe, Arabic that those texts were written in are not really considered to be holy in the same way that a translation would be. That's my understanding. I am not of Islamic faith, so please feel free to correct me if there's some nuances there that I'm missing. And that was also true for a very long time in Christianity, for example. The whole split between Catholicism and Protestantism, I mean, not entirely, but a lot of that was derived from should there be translations made from the Latin texts at that point, from the Latin into the common languages that Christians throughout at that time, mostly Europe, could read. And so, I mean, there was entire wars fought about that. We had an entire schism within one of the largest religions on the planet, and one of the key tenets of the reason why that happened was that portion of the people in that faith said, no, I want to be able to read this in the language that it was written in. So that's kind of where my mind immediately goes, and I do think that just that whole conversation of if you have something that's considered to be sacred or holy, there's a different weight put on being able to really understand what the original text says that I think does exist to some degree if you're doing kind of like more rigorous like literary studies, which we'll talk about that sort of as the next step on this continuum here in a minute, but it's not the same kind of stakes. If it's literally, you think, well, for example, I can speak for Christianity, if you really, there's a very large portion of Christians who believe that the Christian Bible is the word of God. That means different things to different people, but it is considered to be a sacred, holy text that is divine revelation to some degree. What does it mean that you can read it in English versus this is my Greek New Testament? And actually, even just that, the whole fight that I was talking about earlier between Catholics and Protestants, what that was also failing to acknowledge is that the Latin itself was a translation from what was mostly Greek and Hebrew. There's, I think, a bigger emphasis on like, okay, if you think that this these Greek words are literal revelation from like a single divine creator, it becomes more important for you to be able to actually know exactly what it says. And in my graduate program, I spent a lot of time like on, I might take like this little paragraph and like talk in detail about why the conjugation of this specific Greek verb had this specific connotation to it. And I think having that process really did give me an appreciation for how much you can kind of like meditate or dive into a very small piece of text by really thinking about the specifics of what does this word mean. I think that kind of training, and the fact that I come from a fundamentalist evangelical tradition originally, which was very focused on a literal interpretation of the Bible, where there is a lot of emphasis placed on kind of like sentence to sentence individual word interpretation, or exegesis would be the word that would be used, I do think has given me an appreciation for that kind of close reading. I think that it's something that I'm thankful I have the skill set from those experiences to apply to literature more broadly. But I will say, I think maybe we'll take the next step at this point. I think that kind of, we need to specifically know what this word actually really means, is for the most part not necessary for most reading and translations. So I do think when it comes to, if you are a scholar, or even if you are kind of trying to do a very close reading of a work of literature and you're wanting to really dissect what each of those words mean, I do think that there is some value in being able to read a text in its original language and hopefully understand some of the context. But something that, I think comes up in when we're talking about holy texts that were written hundreds and hundreds of years ago, I think that this also applies for literature that was written in the past. And then even works in translation that are written in a culture that is different from yours. I think that assuming you can really understand that individual word, this maybe gets into a little bit of the philosophy piece of this that I'm trying not to go too deep into, I think is probably not a great assumption. Even if, okay, for instance, I speak French. I, at one point I would say was fluent, and at this point I would say I can understand pretty well and I can still read very well. I speak that language. I spent a lot of time studying French history as a part of my minor in my undergrad, and even when I was in high school, we spent a lot of time talking about different French cultures and history and literature. I've read a lot of French literature in translation. Camus, Sartre, Le Petit Prince. The first book I ever read fully in French was Candide from Voltaire. I've read a lot of French language in its original language, and I can tell you that yes, I do think that I got things from being able to read those pieces of literature in the French, as opposed to having read it as an English reader reading a translation. Do I think that there were things I gleaned from that I wouldn't have without having read it in the original, and being able to appreciate some of the, wordplay that's happening that doesn't work as well in English, etc.? Yes, I don't doubt, I know for a fact that is the case, that I got things from that experience that I would not have if I'd only read those in their English translation. So I totally think that is true. That being said, I do think it would be somewhat presumptuous, or honestly kind of culturally arrogant of me to assume that even if I'm understanding more of the text by reading in its original language, even if it's a contemporary work, I'm not picking up on all of the kind of cultural references that probably are evident to the people who are reading it from that own culture perspective. I think about in English, even things, there are pieces of, for instance, Southern literature from America, the Southeast, basically. I know that there are things that I have read in the American literary canon that I think that I have a specific appreciation for, because this is the region that I come from. I'm familiar with, for instance, certain idioms that are unique to the South, and certain kind of references in terms of landscape or culture, etc., that it just intuitively, even if I'm not conscious of it, I pick up on, that I wouldn't even if I lived in a different part of America. And I'm sure that is also true for American literature that comes from different regions of the country. So I do, while I want to say yes, I think there is value in getting a certain level of faithfulness to the original text in a translation. I do think that that's important. And maybe now that I'm talking this through, I'm kind of coming up with this outline as I'm going. Now that I'm talking this through, maybe we can come back to sort of respect for the original here in a minute when we get to things that I do value in a translation. I also think that this kind of discussion or posturing around, if I read it in the original, that is always a superior experience because I will have some kind of mastery over the text that I would not if I did not read it in the original. I think you have to be careful with that, because I think that you honestly can get to a place where you're being a little too comfortable with your own ability or comfort level that you're understanding everything that there is to understand, because you are still on some level going to be an outsider if that was not your original language. So with all that being said, I do want to then say, I do think that some level of faithfulness to the original in a translation is important, especially if you are talking about books where a lot of what their kind of value to you as a reader is, or sort of your experience of the text is, centers around really diving into the language itself. That tends to be sort of more like literary fiction or literary nonfiction. Actually, not even literary nonfiction, just nonfiction in general, where it's specifically trying to communicate something to you, like you're supposed to be receiving knowledge in a more kind of like direct, less abstract way. I do think some kind of literalness in a translation is important. That being said, for instance, Dorothy L. Sayers has a famous translation of Dante's Inferno, Paradiso, and Purgatorio? I never remember how to say that middle one. She has a famous translation where she is taking from the Italian into English, and she specifically tried to keep the rhyme scheme from the Italian and translate it into English so that English readers could get a sense of the kind of flow of the poetry, which if you take a more literal translation is lost. So in that case, you could ask, okay, well, in that situation, what she is prioritizing is your experience of a poem as opposed to a one-to-one, this is this exact word. So which of those is a more faithful translation? I think, I've seen arguments made both ways. I think for me, what it comes down to, for the most part, for translations into fiction, let's focus on that. I want something that is readable. I want something that, yes, is faithful to the original in terms of like, it's not really changing the story, really radically changing word choices, etc. But part of what a good translation to me does is it takes the original and puts it into wording and sentence structure and flow that is pleasing to a native English speaker's sort of internal ear for text. So one thing I wanted to mention is that I notice, particularly in mysteries for whatever reason, because that tends to be most of the sort of like contemporary fiction that I'm reading in translation these days, there seems to be kind of a value for keeping more of the sort of one-to-one word translation than smoothing out some of the sentences. And for that reason, I can think of a few, like The Silence of the White City by Eva Garcia Sanez. I think that was the author. The Black Jersey by Jorge Zapata Patterson, I think was the author. A couple of those where I could tell that what I think it was happening was that the translator was trying to preserve some of the original wording from, I believe in both those cases, actually, it would have been the Spanish. But to an English ear, it was quite choppy. So for me, in that situation where really what I'm reading for is an entertainment, I'm reading to enjoy this mystery, I would have preferred there be a prioritization, readability, and smoothing out that sentence structure so that I would not be kind of interrupted from my reading flow so much, which I think just was not the approach of the translators. And this also, I guess we could have like a whole tangent here about like a good translation truly is an art form. People who are able to kind of balance all of these different factors we've been talking about, it's a real art and skill, and a good a good man is hard to find, like Flannery O'Connor says. A good translator, I think, is hard to find. So when you have someone who can kind of approach a text with a lot of these different factors in mind and produce something that is meaningfully faithful to the original while still being readable to the language that's being translated into, that is an art. And I think hurrah for translators. They are, I think, undervalued and underpaid people, but they are doing the Lord's good work of trying to help people understand what's going on. And again, because so much of this, I think of so much of this in terms of like Bible translations, just from my degree and my kind of background. I mean, you think about something like The Message, which is a very contemporary translation by Eugene Peterson, sort of in the same spirit of this original one we were talking about, where there's really not an emphasis on a word for word translation, and there's much more an emphasis on communicating what the interpreter or the translator thinks is the meaning, I think that there's a huge value for that of, hey, like here's a really accessible version of this that you can just sort of breeze through. It's probably not going to be the only version in the case of like a Bible that you should encounter, or like, well, there you go. I'm so programmed to talk about this. Many people would argue that you should not only encounter a holy text in that context, but there is a value to being able to just kind of read something and get an idea of what's happening, as opposed to being kind of kept at a distance from more archaic language or more literal translations. So I think what I tend to value, all that to say, in translation, I think I'm more skewed towards the end of some level of faithfulness to the original. So if, for instance, it's a classic that's being translated, like I think a great example of, I think, a really good translation was one I read from, I can't remember the translator, sadly. I'll put an image of this, but there was a translation I read probably about 5 years ago now that I thought did a really nice job. And obviously I don't speak Russian, I can't say for sure. It seemed to me like they were preserving a lot of the original kind of a little bit more formal or archaic language choices that would have been common at the time that this book was written. It preserves a lot of that, but it still was incredibly readable to a modern English reader. So for me, that is really the sweet spot. Like to me, that's what you are looking for in a translation. Something that you can easily get through. You're not constantly having your reading being interrupted because you're like, it's kind of a wonky sentence. Like, okay, I think I see what's happening. That to me, I think, especially for things like classics where we're really trying to get people to just get into them and give them a try, make them more approachable for people. I would much rather have something that's like approachable than something that is completely faithful. Now, if you are a serious student of a given text, like, yeah, I do think that, I mean, when I was in grad school, I was reading a lot of philosophy. I already spoke French, so I could kind of get in with the French philosophers and read some of it in the original. But there were some German philosophers I had to like go grab like the German to English dictionary thing and kind of try to look up some of these kind of words that were left in the original German, because there was no really good English translation. So you needed to sort of get a few different references to get the kind of idea of what this German word meant. And I think that there was value in that, because that was like serious academic study where I was very specifically focusing on what words is this person using, like what verb is this, and like what are all the connotations of it. I think that if you're a serious student of literature, if for example you were not a native English speaker and you were studying Jane Eyre, there would certainly be passages of that where it would behoove you to either speak English or to get a dictionary that could do a translation for you to really dig into like, okay, what are the nuances of kind of the connotations of this adjective or verb. I think there is a place for that, but I think for the most part, casual readers of classic fiction or even just generally fiction in translation, I would much rather you get a translation that you can just read through. And if you decide you want to dig in deeper and you want to reread it and you want to get a different translation that's more literal, sure. But for me in general, a literal translation both interrupts the reading experience for most people, and I frankly think gives people an overconfidence that if they are trying to be like a student of the text, an overconfidence that they're picking up on all of the nuances of what is being communicated. So that's just my kind of rambly thoughts about translation. Hopefully that was somewhat interesting. But let me know what you think about translations. Do you read a lot of works in translation? Like I said, for me, most of what I read in translation these days tends to be either a classic or a mystery. Those seem to be a lot of the ones that I pick up that are in translation. But let me know what thoughts you have about this subject in the comments below. I hope this satisfied people's interest in this topic. When I raised it casually, people seem to be very into it. So I hope this met your hopes or expectations. And yeah, I think that will do it for me. So if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below. Oh, and I also have a link to Boardwalk, which is where I got this book nerd hoodie that I've been obsessed with. So if you want to check that out, I have an affiliated link down below. But yeah, I think that will do it for me. Hope you're having an absolutely lovely day today, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye.